And now we will have the second commentary remarks from Associate Research Professor Tuomas Matikka. He is currently working at VATT Institute for Economic Research.
Kiitos. Joo, kiitos. Thank you. First, yes, I want also to thank the Kalevi Sorsa Foundation and Lauri for the kind invitation, and also thanks Sebastian and Piers for their insightful talks before. So I was asked to give a brief remark on this interesting and very important topic from the from the Finnish perspective, and I'll be talking more about this kind of a micro level, what happens at the firm level, kind of evidence on this talk as well. So first, when talking about Finland, some of these things were already discussed in the previous talks, but of course, you know, probably most in this room know about these sort of key economic challenges in Finland at the moment. So first we have, you know, significant budget imbalance and perhaps some debt issues, public debt issues in the future as well. So sort of mainly driven by the increasing public spendings, particularly in the healthcare sector. There are, like, you know, you cannot escape the headlines at the moment. And I think most economists or researchers probably agree that we need to balance the budget at least at some point, either with spending cuts, and by spending cuts I mean particularly spending cuts on healthcare, or by increasing our fiscal revenues or increasing the taxes. So these are basically the choices that we're going to have to face anyway. So that's probably, we have been talking about the increasing like spending or increasing healthcare costs for like as long as I remember, but now we're sort of starting to see the realization. So there's sort of, perhaps it seems a bit wondering that this have come as a surprise, but probably it is something that we should have foreseen already years ago. And at the same time, sort of what Piers was talking about, sort of globally, but also in Finland, sort of we are sort of plagued with low productivity and economic growth as well. So we haven't escaped these kind of problems in Finland either. But sort of in principle, of course, if we would have higher growth and higher productivity, this could like alleviate the pressures from the fiscal budget. But at the same time, sort of issues with productivity are far from simple to solve. Of course, if there would be sort of a very simple answer, like cutting the tax rates, we would have sort of done it already, and countries would have done it already, we have sort of been rid of this problem. And this probably, sort of, if you want to increase productivity and economic growth, sort of through these issues by the public sector, they are also likely to be costly. So, of course, then the important question is, so how can we boost economic growth or productivity without much leeway from the public budget, as we are in sort of the current situation in Finland? And I think sort of this would cause for more and more careful considerations of the policy choices that can actually enhance productivity and growth. Okay, so of course, yeah, the very important topic of the day is sort of, can we, or sort of one question that arises from this topic is that sort of, okay, can we cut business taxes in order to spur growth and investments? So sort of my 2 cents on this, in a sense, I think also aligns with the previous speakers. The sort of short answer is that yes, we can, but we have to understand that the scope of this is probably also very limited. So we can do something, but we sort of cannot solve the problem with this. And sort of align with sort of Sebastian's talking about free lunch. So sort of I agree on this, that there is no free lunch. So I think it's unrealistic to assume that we could cut business taxes and improve fiscal balance at the same time. So these are sort of, this is the trade-off still that we are facing. So if we cut business taxes, we might get some more investments and growth, but we're also making the fiscal balance worse at the same time. And yes, as we already discussed before, there's sort of the empirical evidence on the impact of business taxes is increasing internationally, which is a really good thing. And sort of, and even without, I think, if you look at the recent studies, and especially the studies that are sort of really aiming to sort of uncover the causal relationship between taxes and investments and fair policy, you don't even much need to correct for the publication bias to say that the sort of the scope of business tax cuts to boost economic growth is, or to boost investments at least, is rather limited. But sort of as Piers already pointed out, there's significant heterogeneity by policy type and within different types of firms. So there are So there are a lot of sort of, depending on what kind of a tax we are reforming, and how we are reforming it, and which types of, and what the firms are doing, and which is the sort of the lifespan of the firm, affects also quite a lot of what we actually observe the firms to respond to these taxes. And that's something that we need to take into account. Yeah, but for Finland, I think the empirical evidence or the empirical literature is small, but sort of gradually increasing. Of course, one of the issues in Finland is that, of course, we are a small country, but I think even as relative to this, I think there's a really sort of also an issue with resources on this research. So there's only a handful of people who are actually working on this. The people like to talk about it a lot, as Lauri said, but who are actually sort of hands-on and doing this kind of careful empirical research. So we could fit all these people in Finland into a large taxi at the moment. So in a sense, this is, if you want to know more about this, I think we should also invest some resources on this research as well. But we are doing the best as we can at the moment to do this, and I have some sort of examples, first couple of examples from Finland, and then one sort of really new international example on this. So this is a paper that has been sort of brought up already before, but sort of in this paper, we try to sort of answer the question of can we increase the investments of particularly these kind of small and medium-sized firms by cutting the business tax. So these types of firms, we think about this kind of a growing smaller firm. If you look at the sort of the research literature and maybe sort of the overall economic development of firms over the cycle, is that sort of these firms are often viewed to be sort of very central in economic growth and in particular job creation. So perhaps these sort of more mature large firms do not grow or do not employ as rapidly more people than these sort of growing firms. And of course there's a lot of discussion on how we should help these firms to grow faster and grow more efficiently. And of course one idea would be to sort of, okay, maybe we should cut taxes on these firms. But actually in our paper sort of we don't find any sort of overall evidence of investment responses to a large corporate tax cut among these types of firms. So what we do in the paper is that we look at the sort of the significant corporate tax cuts in Finland that happened in 2012 to 2014. So we cut the corporate tax rate from 26 to 20%. And in this paper, sort of we compare the small corporations to sort of the very similar partnership firms who operate sort of in very similar sectors in Finland at the same time. And we do not find sort of any average effects on investments for these small firms. There's some heterogeneity here as well. It's not in the slides, but should be mentioned maybe, that we find some small investment responses for the sort of more cash-constrained firms. So this kind of availability of resources matters here. And still, even on average, we find sort of some other effects. So we find kind of these motor effects on the increases in business activity. So we find that the business tax cuts still help these firms to grow a bit faster in terms of their sort of in their growth rate of turnover, for example. Yes, but of course, so in this Finnish study, so to have causal evidence, we were sort of restricted on looking at these smaller and medium-sized firms. So we cannot actually say much about sort of what happened to all firms, or what happened to larger firms in this corporate tax cut, or when you cut the corporate tax. But I'll come back to this on a couple of slides. But then another example, and maybe a topic that hasn't been raised much here yet today, are the sort of the labor costs of the firms. So this is something that sort of often raises also in the discussions on sort of, should we cut the labor cost of these firms to spur growth and investments, and also particularly employment of the firms. So it is often argued that these costs are sort of important barriers for growth of these firms. And maybe if you think about sort of the public sector or the government, so one of the key instruments here are the payroll taxes. So what firms have to pay in addition to these wages when they for their workers. So this, for example, like the pension payments in Finland, probably the biggest payroll taxes in this context. So my colleagues Josef Benchati and Jarkko Harju used this nice variation in Finland to study these effects in their paper. And what they actually find in this paper is that actually it's sort of that these payroll taxes seem to have much more larger effects on investments and employment compared to these corporate tax rate cuts. So it seems that these sort of the labor costs that the firms need to pay are likely to be more important than, for example, the corporate tax. And this is also not relying only on this sort of one Finnish paper. There's also international evidence sort of pointing towards this direction that sort of the labor costs are probably more important than, for example, dividends or corporate tax rates. And what they find in the paper is that when the labor cost, or when the cost of labor increases, firms actually substitute away from these low-skilled workers towards more high-skilled workers, and they reduced capital investments as well. So in a sense, one interpretation of this, and in a sense, like challenges the maybe also these traditional theories that were mentioned here, is that actually sort of investments are not necessarily sort of substitutes to labor. So we would invest more in capital or invest more in machinery, and then we can cut our workers. It seems that they're more complements actually. You need also the workers to have the investments, and you particularly need the high-skilled workers for the investment. So of course technology is changing a lot, so this is probably also something that we need more evidence on, but something that sort of seems to be very interesting and also challenging in terms of what we sort of think of these linkages from the literature before. Okay, so then about the business taxes. So this is not a paper from Finland, but I sort of brought it up here because I think it's a really nice paper. It's a really nice evidence. So, okay, and there's not much evidence on this kind of corporate tax rate cuts from like looking at this sort of broader spectrum of all businesses at the sort of firm level, at the micro level. So this paper looks at the massive Trump tax cuts in 2017, when in the US the corporate tax rate cuts it was sort of a really enormous tax rate cut from 35 to 21%. So the US is now has an almost as low as a corporate tax rate as in Finland. So, and what the Dobridge and others do in this paper is that they compare these corporations, that the firms that are subject to the corporate tax, what happened to their economic development relative to other firms in the US that are not subject to the corporate tax. I'm not going to go into the details in the US business structure here, but sort of I think the empirical setup is really nice here as well. So what they actually see is that, of course, what you maybe could have presumed that if you sort of have this kind of a supermassive cut in the corporate tax rate, probably something's going to happen, right? So what they actually find that there is a significant increase in investment and output, but it's not close enough to compensate actually for the tax revenue losses. So this is something that, again, sort of supporting for that there is no sort of free lunch effect here. So the investment effects are large, but still not enough to actually provide this kind of extra benefits to the economy, and especially in thinking, sort of relating this back to the Finnish context when we are sort of also sort of really serious troubles with the public budget. So in a sense that this sort of adds evidence on that. And maybe one thing about, so this is before I sort of conclude, one point here is that they have really nice evidence on the incidence of business taxes. So when we think about a business, so business is actually sort of, it's just a combination of ideas, capital, machinery, and people, right? So, and in the end, all the taxes are borne by the people. So not the ideas and the machines, they don't pay taxes. So people are the ones who pay taxes. So we need to track down, if we want to sort of have the full picture of corporate tax reforms and how corporate taxes affect various things, we can also sort of track down sort of who actually sort of benefits from these tax cuts and who suffers from the increases in corporate tax rates, for example. And sort of this is also what this paper does really nicely. So it sort of can link all the workers and firm owners back to these firms, and they can look at sort of who are the ones who are gaining from this corporate tax cut. So whose incomes are increased by this. So what they see in that paper, that most of the gains occur to the firm owners, more than half of it, and then almost all of the rest goes stems to the high-skilled workers or the high-paid workers of these firms. And this is sort of just the graph from the paper. We can see here that on the horizontal axis, so there's the income distribution, so from the lowest to the highest earner, and then there's the effect on the vertical axis, effect of the reform on the earnings, and we see that sort of up to the 90th percentile, sort of the effect on incomes is zero for these people, and only at the very top there's actually an increase in the incomes. So this is also something that we need to think about. So maybe this kind of ideas that if we cut business taxes, it would help the incomes of everybody, but there's actually evidence. This is not the only evidence, but sort of I think this is also really nice detailed evidence showing that this is probably not the case. So the gains fall to the top in these kind of things. Okay, just now briefly to conclude. So I think sort of my view, and I think sort of maybe sort of the research view at the micro level is that so business taxes tend to find effects on economic activity, and they're, for example, I think consistently much larger when we compare to, for example, effects on if you cut income taxes to labor supply, for example. So these effects for normal wage earners are sort of zero or pretty close to zero, but typically what we find for business taxes are the effects are a bit larger. But the scope of this is still not extensive, so they are not likely to pay from themselves. And also the heterogeneity. So there's a lot of firms respond differently and also differently to different types of policies. And I think this calls for much more considerations from the policymakers to think about which reforms would actually work and which do not. And I think it was nice actually to Piers to sort of brought up this sort of trade-off between targeting and sort of this overall rate cuts. I think that's something that we should discuss more, I think, at the moment. And especially in these kind of situations where you have these public budget problems as well. So whether should we target more instead of just cutting the taxes universally if we want to sort of somehow try to boost investment and economic activity. And also finally, I want to sort of stress out that, okay, taxation and growth is the issue or sort of the topic of the thing, but I think sort of taxation is still probably not the main issue behind productivity, for example. So I think we need to pay a lot of attention also to keeping the rules for productivity strong. So especially we need to take care that we have enough skilled and educated workers, either who we educate from ourselves or who are coming from somewhere else to Finland. And this is sort of, for example, highlighted also by the Ben-Sarti and Harju paper that sort of these are complements, these are likely to be complements for the investments, not substitutes for them. And also we need to take care of our public infrastructure and sort of that we have a stable environment for firms to operate and look into the future, because investments are not made sort of thinking about what happens today or tomorrow, that what happens after 10 or 15 or 20 years. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Tuomas, and I won't be letting you go from the stage because now we move to the Q&A. I'll just grab some mics from here, and I would like to ask Piers and Sebastian on the stage as well. And let's turn these on. Here you go. And here we go. All right. I hope you all been making some notes during the presentations and commentary remarks, because now we have some time for question and answers. I can start with, because well, we've been talking about tax cuts and public investments and how those will affect growth. But in the meantime, the Finnish government aims to consolidate public finances, and Finland might also need to raise some money to fund increasing costs, especially in defense budget and green investments. So what do you think, what would be the impact if we would increase corporate and dividend tax to fund these investments and decrease public deficits? What do you think would happen? Who would like to start? Sebastian, go ahead.
Okay, so since I was the first speaker, maybe that's also okay. So I had time to relax in the interim time, so the others may still want to recover a bit from their talks. So yeah, it's a good question. I mean, of course, it's like squaring the circle a bit when you are in a situation like Finland, but also like other economies like my country, Germany, where you are stuck in a situation with inflation was high in the past. Now inflation has luckily come down, but growth is still low, and your business cycle is not in a good shape, right? at the same time, you're forced to increase your military spending because of the aggression of Russia and also the demands from our international partners. And at the same time, you have a budget deficit that's larger than you want it to be, right? And of course, then if we reconsider the evidence that was presented in this, in all these three presentations, then maybe one answer to that whole question is not as it is typically done, that we can simply increase our business activity by lowering taxes, but when you lower your taxes, this comes at this trade-off that you have to find the money somewhere else, right? And at the same time, you want to obey to these fiscal rules. So, so my answer to this would be basically, if you want to, say, boost your economy on the one hand, and then at the same time also try to shield your public balances for not spiraling out of control, then one typical measure would be to actually try to target those investment spending by firms by increasing the depreciation allowances. So this is a very cheap measure. So Germany has done this in the past to reinforce your business cycle firm investment because this only comes at a temporary cost, right? So you reduce currently the tax load on businesses, but very quickly after some time, the depreciation that was allowed to the firms then will have to be paid later on. So this only shifts some public funds towards the future, but you get the returns later on, and at the same time, businesses will can increase their investment activities, which helps your economy also to grow, and that also helps you to consolidate your budget, because if the economy runs better, then also your taxes will be larger.
Yeah, that was a very thorough answer. Piers.
I mean, in terms of additional revenue raising, I think the best answer is really to try to look at base broadening, by which I mean to try and look at your tax expenditures and see whether they're all really delivering value for money. That work is really hard. It's hard kind of empirically to really get good evidence on effectiveness of the tax expenditures, get kind of high quality kind of micro evidence. I think that's very labor intensive, and it's also politically challenging, because if you have a group that's been targeted with a tax expenditure, they are the ones who will protest very loudly against the tax expenditure, but everybody else in society may benefit because they can avoid an increase in the headline rate, be it the corporate rate or the personal rate or the VAT rate, but those who benefit will say nothing. Those who lose out will say a lot, and that's what makes tax expenditure reform very, very hard. But tax expenditure reform, I think, is just usually a far superior way to gain additional revenue rather than changes in headline rates. But I don't say it's easy.
Yeah, Tuomas.
Yeah, maybe this sort of to this question, I think it's just looking at the sort of research evidence and thinking about what to do if we would sort of need to increase taxes to sort of. That's also, of course, a political choice. But if you want to use the sort of tax instruments to sort of to get rid of the imbalance, so maybe the business tax wouldn't be the first that I would consider. Still, I think sort of, and maybe there's also this. You maybe broaden the base, but I don't know. The base is pretty broad already in Finland. But maybe I would sort of just in terms of increasing revenue. Of course, we just increase the VAT, and that's pretty high as well. But maybe I would call for maybe more of this kind of broader base taxes, like the income tax, for example, that I would sort of maybe rather increase, and also in that sort of, if you want to have it more balanced at the top of the distribution, maybe also increase the dividend tax. Maybe sort of, I think one of the last in lines would still be the business tax, even though sort of course, sort of maybe the size of the effects isn't extensive, but probably we still have sort of the most sort of concise evidence that there are these kind of effects more or less in the business tax line, for example, in the individual income tax. Thanks.
Yeah. Hey, let's take questions from the audience. Just raise your hand and yeah, all there. Yeah, here comes the mic. Because we're on the stream, so
yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm Patrizio Laina, Chief Economist at Finnish Confederation of Professionals, STTK. That's a trade union confederation in Finland. I would like to ask you about tax incentives that have been applied in Finland and in many other European countries now that we need to make this sort of clean transition. And I understood that at least Piers commented that even this sort of more targeted instruments, you were a bit critical of them, but do you think that these sort of targeted instruments for green transition, for instance in Finland we have this tax incentive for large-scale industrial investments in clean tech or clean transition, so how do you find this kind of tax incentives, and do you see that these kinds of instruments should be then financed with tax hikes in different corporate taxes, and what taxes would you increase?
I mean, without commenting on the specifics of the Finnish incentive, which I'm not familiar with, I mean, in general, in terms of it's very important to support the green transition. We need to do that. Everyone knows that. The classic economist answer would be that the most efficient way to do that is through an effective price on carbon. So that would be the number one thing that we say. We know that a lot of countries find it very politically challenging to levy a carbon price to the extent that is required. So I think in that context, there is an argument for clean incentives. You know, tax incentives, they're not easy questions. We flag the warnings very strongly because we think the warnings are often not heeded. We flag the need for assessment very strongly because we think oftentimes they're not assessed. But that's not to say that they can't be used. The standard argument for using a tax incentive or a subsidy is when you have what they call kind of an externality, you know, like an economic externality. You something by the private decision maker where they won't make the right decision left alone. So in R&D, you know, I won't make enough R&D by myself, given the positive spillovers to everybody else. In the green space, I won't do enough greening by myself, given the positive impacts on everybody else. So I think that's where the case for clean incentives lies. I think it's particularly strong where the carbon price is not effective, but even in the presence of the carbon price, there are other frictions, you know, financial frictions, learning by doing, you know, technologies can be path dependent. There's a lot of, the case for state support is strong, I think. Exactly how it should happen through the tax system? Should it happen through subsidies? Should it happen for subsidies for large firms, small firms? I think a lot of those questions are not clear.
Tuomas.
Yeah, so yeah, that's a good question, and I sort of agree. Of course, I think we all agree that sort of we need to sort of take this sort of green transition seriously. But I'm sort of, especially in the Finnish case, I like to be sort of optimistic and sort of hope this works. But also I'm a sort of bit pessimistic on it. This will cost a lot of money, and probably sort of the key issue is that whether we sort of can actually produce some new green investments. So probably this is happening already, and now we're also paying a lot of money to these firms that are doing this anyway. So in a sense, I think this can be very, very costly. And sort of if you think about financing this by levying some other taxes, so of course then that's an issue we need to. So if you want to sort of make this a budget neutral, so then it's more challenging this way. So I think as sort of peers were, so there are a lot of political problems here on sort of how to do this politically, but I think also doing this kind of transition without any sort of taxes or regulation sort of that are more binding than this sort of per incentive stuff, it doesn't seem very likely, but sort of maybe. I try to stay optimistic, so this is decided already, so we can probably evaluate it after that, so let's see what happens, but I'm not holding my breath on this, but let's see.
Sebastian, do you want to comment this as well?
Yeah, maybe. So I think there are also always these kind of nice ideas around where you try to kill two birds with one stone, which is somehow a bad idiom when you think about environmental issues, right? That you're killing birds. But so let's not use the idiom, and also let's not buy too much into that idea, because I think if we want to solve the climate crisis, I think one of the most important things that is often forgotten is that even like carbon prices, they can work, but we always hope for people really to change their behavior, right? And the thing is, how can people change their behavior? And the most important thing to achieve that is, I think, that we need to change our infrastructure a lot, right? So we need to change our public transport systems, we need to change our city planning, and this comes from public investment. And I think this is one of the most important things that is usually forgotten in these international debates about what is the best public policy against climate change.
Then we had one question on the, oh there, yes. Yep, there will be a microphone. What?
I think it's better for our screen.
Thank you. I am, should I say my name or what?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
I just want to ask two things. Is there a critical mass that would make tax reductions more effective for growth? And I ask this because I come from that unhappy country that Sebastian mentioned, Greece. And I know, I'm not an expert, I'm not an economist, I'm a regional economic developer, but not an economist. But I know from inside that Greece had lost a lot of real economy. And that's how it became problem, deep down. Even if the measures were not so horrible, it would still be in trouble, and I'm sad to say. But now if we forget Greece, is there a critical mass of the space or of the diversification of the economy that would probably contribute to making tax reductions more effective? Thanks.
Yeah. Who would like to start? Piers. Yeah.
Could I ask just before, what do you mean by critical mass?
If we go to a region in Finland called Kalevi, it has very big dependence on the mining industry. No matter how much the mining industry brings back to the regional economy, the population, the diversification economy does not grow. So it doesn't go to a diversified economy of scale. And because I have been working there many years, and my explanation is that the critical mass does not allow an effective diversification. Do I make sense at all?
Well, yeah, of course, in a sense, yeah, that I think, especially sort of in the case of maybe Finland, diversification of industries is an important factor, and we have been thinking about this a lot. In a sense, think about this historical background also that sort of explains probably also kind of in other regions in Finland that in the 1930s we were still a developing country, right? So there wasn't much industry. Most of the people were farmers, and for example, so the Finnish industry is not very diversified. So that's also one issue. But I do not necessarily sort of. Maybe that's an explanation, but I don't know if that's a global explanation of why these tax cuts probably might not work as well as they should. But I don't know a clear way of tax policies changing this. I think this is some more of maybe the things I said in the final days about growth and productivity, sort of other issues than taxes, what we can do. So this is more about public spending, public infrastructure, and sort of doing these kind of public investments towards investments rather than the tax rate side of that. I think sort of that maybe speaks more on this sort of what the public sector can do to spur growth and investments on this, and also something that Sebastian pointed out that sort of has been shown to be maybe a bit more effective as well. Yeah, thanks. I don't know if that answered your question or.
Yeah, I would only add to echo, and I thought it was very well said in your final slide, that you cannot consider tax policy in isolation from the rest of your economic policies, right? So this speaks then to the risks of wasteful incentives, that if you're providing an incentive for something that's not well supported by the rest of your policy mix, then you're not doing tax policy the right way, right?
I think we have still time for one quick question. Yeah, oh there, yes.
Okay, I'll try to make this quick. Sebastian, in your presentation, I feel like the marginal propensity to consume was a common thread that explained a lot of the empirical data. This is more of a comment, actually, but given the fact that it seems to explain a lot of the empirical evidence, if we look at, investment is more effective in a recession because there people have higher marginal propensity to consume. If you direct money more into the hands of people who spend it, it's going to have a higher multiplier, basically. Given this empirical data and kind of like this underlying, basically like explanation for that empirical data, wouldn't it then make sense in a recession to do precisely what you kind of suggested, even if you are fiscally constrained, as Finland kind of is, Germany kind of is, well, at least in terms of EU rules, wouldn't it make sense to actually spend money so that the fiscal multiplier is high enough so that you actually reduce debt to GDP? I mean, it only requires a momentary leap of faith to spend that money to then kind of reduce the ratio. And I know this is blasphemous because I haven't said anything about taxes in a tax thing, but sorry.
Sebastian, would you like to comment?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe just briefly, so when your first question came, I was also kind of thinking, okay, so maybe another solution, of course, if you want to raise your revenues, is tax the rich, right? And that also comes from the observation that rich people also not tend to have high marginal propensities to consume, but rather low, and the opposite is true for usually poor people. So one typical measure in particular to take during a recession could also be to redistribute income from richer to poorer people, in particular when inequality is already quite high. I mean, there are studies for the United States where inequality is much of a bigger problem than it is for countries like Finland and other Central European countries. But still, such measures could have a positive net effect, while at the same time also having a multiplier effect that would also maybe even reduce the debt to GDP ratio, right? But of course, one thing to keep in mind is always that reducing the debt to GDP ratio itself is not sufficient to obey to the fiscal rules of the European Union, right? Because you also need to obey to the deficit rules, which are more pressing, so to speak, in the short term than the debt to GDP ratio. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sebastian. And the time flies. I'm looking at my watch, and it seems that we have to wrap up this question and answer section. Let's give one more time very warm applause to our excellent guest speakers, Sebastian Gehert, Piers O'Reilly, and Tuomas Matikka. Thank you.